On Plugged In, the uprising in Sudan and the iconic image that brought down a dictator. But with former Sudan President Omar al-Bashir now out of the picture, some question whether the alternative is any better. Can a new military leader heal months of unrest and a failing economy? Will Bashir finally go on trial for crimes against humanity? And amid forces that threaten to further destabilize the Northeast African country, what does the fall of one dictator mean for the region? Hello, welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. After 30 years in power, Sudan's longest-serving president, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, is under house arrest. On April 11th, he was ousted by his own military after months of unrest. That announcement was made on live TV by the country's defense minister, and it was greeted with joy by protesters outside the army's headquarters in Khartoum. But that euphoria is fading as the prospects for continued military rule in their country looms large. Plugged In Steve Reddish has the latest.
Protesters in Sudan promised to continue their anti-government demonstrations that forced out a dictator and ignited hope for a civilian-led government. President Omar al-Bashir came to power through a military coup 30 years ago and was deposed the same way, arrested on April 11th. Bashir is a wanted man, indicted by the International Criminal Court on charges of directing a genocide against civilians in Sudan's Darfur region. Bashir's departure did little to stop the protests. His initial replacement lasted just one day. Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Burhan has assumed power as chief of the military council and has committed to having a complete civilian government, something the United States has called for.
The Sudanese people are demanding a transition to a political system that is inclusive and has greater legitimacy. The Sudanese authorities must now respond and deliver a credible plan for this political transition.
Street protests over the rising price of bread began in December at the urging of the Sudanese Professional Association, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and engineers, among other professionals. The image of Alaa Salah, a 22-year-old engineering and architecture student, connected many around the world with the protests. Among the SPA's demands, a civilian-led transition with full executive powers, dissolving Bashir's National Congress Party, and dismantling the party's security apparatus and militias. So far, Sudan's feared intelligence chief resigned, and the military council indicated it will work with a prime minister chosen by the protest leaders, who vow to continue their demonstrations until their demands are met. Steve Reddish, VOA News.
According to a report by Reuters, Bashir has been moved from the presidential residence to a prison in Khartoum. He's said to be surrounded by heavy security and in solitary confinement. Uganda's Minister for Foreign Affairs reportedly told Reuters that Uganda would consider granting asylum for Bashir. To discuss the latest developments, we are joined by Ismail Kushkush. He is former acting bureau chief for the New York Times in East Africa and has been a contributor and analyst at various news outlets and networks. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Do you see that Bashir, who's been in power since 1989 and now in custody in Khartoum in a prison in solitary confinement, do you see that he's going to be put on trial for his crimes? He's been accused of genocide, or will he go and get asylum? Which is more likely? Well,
what most Sudanese want is to see him put on trial. Sudanese are divided on how that will go, whether it be through the ICC or through a national tribunal. But I think most Sudanese overwhelmingly want to see him put on trial. The idea of amnesty or refuge in another country, I think most Sudanese will absolutely reject.
All right. Protesters want a civilian government. And when Bashir was ousted, there's a military transitional government. The first one left after 24 hours. He was only there 24 hours. Now they've got a new military transitional government, right?
Right.
And are these the very people who worked for Bashir and took orders from Bashir?
Right. I mean, this is the same military that was under Bashir's command. And this is why people are still protesting. They want to see a genuine transition into civilian government. The army would be a part of that transition, but not as the leaders.
What do you foresee happening?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, I think we have to look at local domestic interest, how different political parties and how they relate to the army and how that will happen. And then I think we have to keep an eye on regional forces that might have their own interests and support particular individuals. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Qatar have all had interest in Sudan. I think there'll be this game of pushing particular individuals to power and so forth. I think that's what's going to happen and unfold in the coming months in Sudan. And that will be the actual determination of what happens. The people want to see a transitional civilian government, but I think all of these forces will have their say also.
I've seen some criticism of this, but some people have suggested this is Arab Spring 2.0. What do you think about that?
Right. I mean, yes, there are parallels, and in some ways, yes, but also I think it's important to remind people that Sudan has its own tradition, its own history of civilian unrest against military rule. The first uprising against a military dictatorship on the continent and in the Middle East was in 1964 in Sudan, what Sudanese call the October Revolution. And again, that happened in April of 1985. So there are local factors, and yes, there are regional factors, but some accept the term, some don't. I think it really depends on what angle you look at it from.
Bashir must have seen this coming. He's traveled a little bit out of Sudan recently. I've been tracking him for about 10 years since I was there. But why has he been able to stay in power for 30 years? That's the first question. Maybe the flip question is, why now?
Well, I think people have mostly underestimated Bashir. Bashir is not just a ruthless or was an authoritarian ruler, but he was a skillful politician. He was a shrewd politician. He knew the army. He knew Sudanese politics well. He knew how to play people against each other, but also regionally. He linked himself to different regional alliances and let go of certain alliances when it was important. He let go of Iran when he thought it was important. He tied himself to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt when he thought it was important. He had links to Qatar and to Turkey, and also with U.S. policy. I mean, the U.S. Looks at Sudan mainly from a security point of view. So he has been very skillful in playing all these players against each other for his own purpose.
What's so interesting to bring that up is it was President Clinton in 1993 that put Sudan on the state-sponsored terrorism list, and so that cut financial assistance, a lot of trade with Sudan. And then recently, in the recent years, they have apparently been very helpful in counterterrorism. So the sanctions have been lifted in 2017. Now the economic sanctions, yet. A little bit of history is that in the 90s, early 90s, he gave Osama bin Laden a place to live.
Right, absolutely. The lifting of sanctions actually, in part, has played a role in this uprising, that there were many hopes that the lifting of sanctions would see foreign investment, especially from the U.S., and that didn't happen. And that's kind of some of the discontent that people had. But Bashir, again, able to negotiate with the U.S. and with regional governments, and that's what has kept him in power so long.
Do you think that he could get a fair trial in Khartoum?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
I mean, I'm not a fan of his. Look, he and I have actually been battling through proxies for the past 10 years.
Right.
But could he get a fair trial?
I think what kind of tribunal and the structure, and if it's just national, local, or there'll be regional and international advisors or so forth, I think those are things to consider. But there's definitely great anger at the past 30 years, and Bashir being top of that government, I think it makes that question very legitimate.
You mentioned the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court in Holland. The United States is not a signatory to that, but they have had an indictment outstanding for him for about 10 years for genocide, and yet he's been able to travel to countries like South Africa and Chad, which are signatories to the ICC, but they never arrested him.
Right, and again, that's a part of his skillful politics. I mean, he did it on purpose. It was in the face of the ICC and in the international community that he would travel to countries, even countries that were signatory to the ICC, like South Africa and Jordan.
South Africa.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
More than 60% of Sudan is 30 years old or younger, and they have never known any other leader than Omar al-Bashir. He was in power for 30 years, Sudan's longest-running president. With more on the Sudanese dictator's rise and fall, here's Plugged In's Mil Arcega.
Born January 1st, 1944, Omar Hassan Ahmed al-Bashir was an army brigadier in 1989 when he led a group of officers in a military coup that ousted the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi. Bashir survived the coup attempt himself a year later, leading to the executions of 30 army and police officers. Bashir was re-elected president in 1996, overseeing the war in Darfur in western Sudan, an ongoing conflict which the United Nations says has killed hundreds of thousands of people. With more trouble brewing in the south, Bashir negotiated an end to the Second Sudanese Civil War, which in 2005 eventually led to the separation of the country that now calls itself South Sudan. Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court in 2009, accused of directing a campaign of mass killing, rape, and pillage against civilians in Darfur. But by early 2019, widespread unrest over food shortages and the country's rapidly declining economy would spark the movement that ultimately led to Bashir's removal from power.
Taking over as Sudan's newest leader is Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Burhan. He is chairman of the Transitional Military Council, a former Sudanese politician and army general. He was later appointed by Bashir as military attaché to China and served as general inspector of the Sudanese armed forces. Over the past few months, he has met several times with protesters to listen to their demands before assuming his new role as the country's transitional leader. Just how transitional is one of the questions many people in Sudan are asking. Another is whether the new military leadership is going to be any different from the previous one. And many ask if the former president will ever be tried for atrocities committed by his government in Darfur and also the Nuba Mountain region. To talk to us about that, along with the political and regional implications of Bashir's ouster, we are joined by Kelsey Lilly. She is policy analyst at Yorktown Solutions and former associate director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, where she coordinated the Council's Sudan Task Force. Welcome.
Thank you.
When was the last time you were in Sudan?
In January 2018.
What do you make of this ouster of Bashir?
It's a really incredible transformation from where we were then. There has always been discontent, but to see the Sudan Professionals Association come together and really have sustained momentum over months it's very impressive.
I use the word interesting probably loosely, is that the protesters want a civilian government. And there's a military transition, and I suppose there has to be some sort of cooperation with the military. They're not standing for that. They want civilian now. And the military people actually were ones that took orders from Bashir.
That's right. And they've said, they're not going to stop demonstrating until they have their full demands met. And they've been demonstrating for months and months, and they're out in the sun in Khartoum, and they're waiting for their demands to be met. And, we don't have any indications that they're willing to settle for any less.
How violent were the protests?
Well, a number of people were killed. Again, these protests have been going on for months, and we've seen a couple of dozen at least. It's very difficult to know the numbers for sure, killed by security forces. But there's also been some reticence inside the security forces to fire on the Sudanese demonstrators. And we've seen some military members, security forces, police actually join in the demonstrations, which just suggests that the security forces are not a monolith. They're very, very powerful, but they're not necessarily united. And perhaps that's a danger of this transition moving forward.
It's interesting, the way that I've tried to get sort of present time information about it is through social media, because Sudan doesn't have a free press. Mm-hmm. I mean, getting information out there is very difficult. I mean, he's been terrorizing the press forever.
That's exactly right, and those are the kind of things that I think suggest that this will be a very long-term transition, and the demonstrators are calling for, a transition to civilian government, but that includes governance changes and political reforms, and includes economic reforms, because we also have to remember that underlies much of the protesters' discontent here.
What about South Sudan, Sudan was segregated in about 2009 into two countries, but how does this affect the neighbors like South Sudan and the region of Africa?
Well, so what we've seen in the past couple of years is that Sudan, and Bashir in particular, has played this peacemaking role, or attempting to play a peacekeeping role with the South Sudanese civil war. And so this certainly throws that into question. But the other thing to remember is that Sudan is home to a lot of South Sudanese refugees. So they were Sudanese, the country split in 2011, and then people fled when the violence started again in 2013 in South Sudan. So what happens to them, amid all of this unrest?
Well, what I've been following this, for years, so interesting is that Bashir's vicious. I mean, he's accused of vicious things. And Salva Kiir, who's the president of South Sudan, has now engaged on rather vicious activities. So Bashir's almost made Salva Kiir's almost made Bashir look more peaceful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think all of that points to this real opportunity for the United States here, which is to call for restraint, to call for the demonstrators' demands to be met, which is a transition to civilian government. And that hasn't worked very well in South Sudan, but that doesn't mean that it can't work in Sudan.
Well, the U.S. Public policy right now is there are negotiations to lift them from the state-sponsored terrorism list, and they're going to have more communications at the end of April. But it appears that the at least public response to the United States is, we're going to stand down and wait to see what happens. But is there a policy more? Is there a better way to describe this?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, they've suspended the negotiations that were ultimately designed to look at the lifting of the state-sponsored terrorism designation. It's really hard to do that when your government interlocutors are in flux, as they have been in Sudan. But I think ultimately that will still remain a piece of U.S. policy because the Sudanese want the state-sponsored terrorism designation lifted. And that's because not only it has this security element to it, it suggests that they aren't sponsoring terrorism anymore, but it also unlocks really desperately needed debt relief. And so that will be something that is on the table when this new government is constituted, and the U.S. will continue some of its engagement, as I think that they should.
Why did this start? I mean, if you read online, it said bread protests. The protest over the price of bread. It began in December. That seems, to many people, that seems an unusual reason. But I mean, economic reasons have often started protests, but it's price of bread.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a multiplicity of reasons that people are turning out into the streets and staying in the streets. The economy has been on the decline for months and months and months, and the Bashir government removed certain subsidies that tripled the price of bread overnight, and that's really precarious for people that are already not making a lot of money, don't see job opportunities.
But why did that happen if the sanctions had been lifted from the United States, and they do have a good bit of oil there? So why was that happening?
Well, I think this is a really corrupt government as well, and you have to understand that the resources that have come from the country's riches are not channeled into poverty reduction and schools and infrastructure, but oftentimes they're channeled into the elite or into the security forces. And so regular Sudanese, they aren't seeing the benefits of the riches of their country.
When I was there was a complaint. I met with President Salva Kiir of South Sudan. He was complaining about the presence of China in both Sudan, South Sudan, and also in the oil business. Does China have a big footprint there?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to say because you see, there's a difference between sort of state-backed enterprises and then regular Chinese merchants or business people. But what you do see, in addition to not only a Chinese presence across East Africa, is the Gulf playing a really important role here. And so thinking about, if not the United States engaging with this government and engaging with what's next, it will be someone else.
Women played a big role in this.
They did.
Which is, I mean, that it's sort of, as we watch, we see the woman dressed in white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so not just women, but also young people. So this is the new generation of Sudan, and they're calling for political changes that they haven't seen probably in all of their lifetimes. And that's really important that it's that generation, and that women in particular and marginalized groups are leading with what comes next in their country.
I don't want to be a naysayer, but oftentimes when horrible dictators get removed, we get horrible dictators back, different ones.
Yeah, that's the challenge. This is a really, really long-term challenge. And again, that's why I say, the U.S. has a very unique opportunity to play a positive role here and to make sure that civilian transfer of power happens and that we set Sudan on a path, where some of those reforms actually do take place.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how this unravels. I'm hopeful for the people of Sudan.
Same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The uprising that led to Bashir's fall was driven in large part by women who led and organized many of the protests. Among them, the woman who suddenly became the heart and soul of the movement that brought down Bashir's government. Alaa Salah is the name of the woman in white who has become the iconic image of the Sudan protests. She received death threats and hate mail after the photo of her standing alone atop a car surrounded by protesters went viral on social media. Salah is a 22-year-old engineering and architecture student who symbolizes the role women have played in the street protests that led to Bashir's downfall. Salah recently tweeted, "You cannot have a revolution without women. You cannot have democracy without women." Now, with the country facing the possibility of continued military rule under a transitional government led by many of the same players, Women, spurred on by Salah's example, have vowed to redouble their efforts, promising to spearhead a revolution to change a country they say would prefer to stifle their voices. So how big of a role did women play in removing Bashir from power? And how do they keep the new military leadership in check? For answer to those questions, we turn to our next guest, Dr. Sarah Abdel Jalil. She is president of the Sudan Doctors Union in the UK and spokesperson for the Sudanese Professionals Association. She joins us live on Skype from London. Thank you for joining us. And tell me, how do you describe the women's role in these protests and now the downfall of Bashir?
Thank you for the invitation. The role of women in Sudan has been very impressive. I'm very proud being a Sudanese woman. But what I always try to mention that Sudanese women before 1989 have always been present in the normal life, as professionals, in politics. Since even the 60s, they were in the parliament. What happened that in 1989 until recently, there has been an intentional suppression for women in Sudan by the regime that's still present until now. And they were pushed to the floor, but the resilience and resistance of the Sudanese women, they pulled themselves up and they participated in all aspects of the peaceful resistance. They were killed, sadly, they were detained, they were tortured, they have been organizing the protest, they have been in the media, they have been writing about it. And we have to remember all the women who sadly as well died in Darfur or Jibal al-Nuba or have been raped during the ongoing resistance.
If you describe how the government oppressed the women since 1989 when Bashir took power, in that time period or even now, I mean, how do men look at the sort of at the fact that women appear to be almost leading this protest now and be the driving force? What's sort of the general on the street view of the Sudanese men towards the women?
I think they're working together. There is working like a collaborative work between all sectors in the community. Men, women, youth, elderly, even you can see children have been participating. And I think women came across very strong because there has been a lot of suppression and they have been sort of hidden away intentionally. They can be subjected to the public law if they raise their concerns. For example, if you raise your concern while you're working in a hospital, being a doctor, about the poor health services, you can be subjected to the public law and you can be slashed. And therefore, all of this suppression has actually made them stronger, and they came across as leaders. And it's very I think, positive to see that the 30 years have not, destroyed the Sudanese women power and ability to fight.
Now, there is no free press in Sudan, and so it's hard to get information out of there. As I noted earlier in the show, I've been into the Nuba Mountain region and seen the atrocities with my own eyes. Is there a way you can, can you tell what it's like how bad has it been for the Sudanese people?
How bad? Is that the question?
That's the question.
I think it has been, there has been a total system failure. It was not about the bread or the price of the bread. There is poor governance, corruption, lack of transparency, and lack of commitment towards development in Sudan. And therefore, people, even if they were not killed by live bullets, they were dying because they don't have access to health services, for example. And that was reflected in the WHO statistical report.
In what I actually saw, though, I saw people in the Nuba Mountain region trying to flee Sudan, living in caves because Bashir was trying to kill them overhead with bombers. Their farms were burned down. The women were raped. The men were maimed. They're eating bugs and leaves. It's just the most unthinkable things, at least in that region.
So when we talk about conflict zone, at the moment, this is a big commitment that we have to concentrate on these areas for reconstruction and rebuilding. This is conflict zone. This is, you can say, where there's war, and we have to think that that has been one of the causes of what's happening. Although it has been a huge, I would say, crime. But if you look at even the urban areas, the stable regions where there is no war, every year in Sudan there has been 2, at least, epidemics of cholera, of dengue, of chikungunya, because all of the infrastructures have been destroyed. There is nothing has been built or nothing has been monitored or regulated. Simply, the government has been spending all the money on the army, the National Intelligence Services, or there has been corruption by the senior leaders.
We have 30 seconds left. Are you optimistic for the future of Sudan, or do you fear a military tribunal is just going to be more of the same?
I am very optimistic. I'm very proud of the peaceful resistance that we led. We are going to give a hope for an African spring, and the Sudan uprising continues.
Does Bashir get if he goes to trial and doesn't get asylum in another country, does he get a fair trial in Khartoum?
Well, I think he should stand up for what he has done. The trial will be fair. There will be justice, transitional justice, and what will happen next, whether he will complete this in Sudan or he will go to the ICC, I think that's something that will be discussed further.
And are you going back to Sudan?
I hope I will be able to go back as soon as possible to celebrate the complete transition to civil government. I hope as well that what I have left in my life will be in my country.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck, and we'll continue to follow this very closely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we go, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge the devastating fire that nearly demolished the historic Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. On April 15th, just days before Easter, many around the world watched in shock and horror as flames engulfed the roof and spires of the landmark cathedral. The blaze spread quickly, bringing down the spire and parts of the cathedral's roof as onlookers gasped and cried. The Notre-Dame Cathedral is a popular pilgrimage for both tourists and Christians and has stood proudly along the banks of the Seine for almost 900 years, surviving the French Revolution and 2 world wars. Its foundation was first laid in 1163 by Pope Alexander III, and it was completed in the 13th century. Today, Notre Dame remains among the world's most famous cathedrals and one of Paris' best-known attractions, drawing more than 13 million visitors a year. The church was under renovation when the fire broke out, but investigators say the cause of the blaze is still unclear. Fortunately, no one was harmed. And as we go to air, a fundraising drive has been started by 3 of France's wealthiest families. It's already raised more than $700 million to rebuild this long-standing jewel of medieval Gothic architecture. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.